Shoot me an email.
Welcome to 2-on-1, where the Reverend Spiff Kendall and the Reverend Arthur Stewart usually tag team people about the pop culture topic of their choice and ask vaguely religious questions pertaining to it. Spiff is introducing our host today, our guest today, because we're
the one, as we call them on Instagram. It is my great joy to bring back Reverend Cara Gilger to talk about the arc of Tony Stark. We all know that I'm a big MCU fan. We all know I've got a love for Cap. And so having this conversation of kind of Tony as Cap's kind of friend, confidant, and I don't know, a foil and traveling companion, traveling journeying companion. This is a conversation that I'm greatly looking forward to. So Cara, do you... Reverend Cara Gilger is doing a lot right now, and so I don't want to miss anything. Do you want to introduce yourself and the ministries that you are a part of and what you're doing? Give your plug.
Sure, I can do that. I'm Reverend Cara Gilger. I am a ministry consultant that works with congregations to help them align where God's, like, their practices and structures to where God is calling them to go. So I do a lot of helping congregations with, hey, Arthur's got my website. I help congregations update their policies, job descriptions, and things like that. I also write at Arthur's Got It, caragilger.com, and as well as several other publications. So that's kind of the gist of it. I do some speaking and some preaching and a little bit of freelance. So that's my ministry right now.
Perfecto.
Perfect. I love that. Well, thank you for joining us. I have a question on just like to start us off. So we on 2-on-1 allow our guests to pick their topics, within conversations. And I'm interested to know like what started this journey for you of Tony specifically, but like, is it an arc for all of the MCU, or what drew you, I guess, to this topic?
Oh, okay. So, COVID happened, and we were at home, and we were bored. And my partner travels for a living, and so this is the longest we have been together since our third month of marriage, 13 years ago. So I was thinking about like what we could do in the evenings, like TV-wise, because we have very different tastes. And so I was like, I have watched 2 or 3 movies out of the Marvel Universe. So I was like, you know what? I think I'm going to go all the way through the Marvel Universe. That would be fun to do. And I told Stephanie what I was doing, and she was like, I love the Marvel Universe, which I'd completely forgotten. And so we did that. And what I found interesting is I actually didn't want to watch any of the Iron Man movies. Like, they're militaristic. I remember the Robert Downey Jr. scandal. Like, it was yuck. Like, I didn't want to do it. I really put it off. But when you're going chronologically through the Marvel universe, like, it really messes things up if you avoid movies. So I ended up watching them, and I ended up liking them far more than I thought I would. I ended up liking Tony's character far more than I thought I would. And it had more depth than just like a guy in a giant iron suit slugging things. And I did not expect that. So I thought, since Stephanie loves Marvel, we could talk about that.
I love that. I like that we're naming that you can't proof text the Marvel movies.
No.
So I want to throw out a couple things on that with Iron Man.
Yeah.
In the creation of him by Stan Lee. Stan Lee specifically invented Tony Stark as a weapons designer who was helping the U.S. military in their conflict in Vietnam at that point. But he did so intentionally to piss off hippies. Like, he was like, what if I create a character who is completely likable, even though he's, immediately rejectable? So that's number one, which I kind of love. Number two is Tony Stark in the comics in the 1980s has one of the most famous arcs about entering recovery for alcoholism. So Robert Downey Jr. was, in fact, like the absolute best choice to play him. And I'm not I'm not taking anything away from what you said, but I have to bring it up because I've been waiting forever to talk about this. The reason he eats Burger King, the reason Tony Stark eats Burger King at the press conference after he's released or he escapes from captivity was because Robert Downey Jr. talked about how what made him get sober was he was messed up walking along a beach eating a Whopper, and he realized how gross it was, and he threw it into the ocean along with all of his drugs. So it was Burger King that was his rock bottom, and that interview is very popular in recovery circles. So he kind of did that as a nod to like, sorry, Burger King. And I love that. There you go. Okay, sorry.
This episode is brought to you by cheeseburgers. I love that. I love that story. I think that's there's something. I was like really looking forward to this conversation because there's something really really magical and something really human about, you know, Tony and Iron Man as one. And so and as we look at our scriptures, and there's, you know, that's a common theme of, you know, how do we address our humanity and the hope for our greatness and all of that. And so I there's so many parallels for scriptures. I'm very excited for our very last question. But
so Cara, what do you think was the best movie to really, if you could only watch one movie to describe and show off Iron Man at his best or at his worst, or better, at his most interesting? What is the essential Iron Man movie?
You know, honestly, like, I still, even though I love Tony's character arc, I have a hard time watching the first two movies because I'm like, I turned to my partner and was like, oh, this was right after the Iraq War when it was still acceptable to like make all of the enemies Middle Eastern. And he's like, yeah. And so I feel like they're important to the plot, but I don't enjoy those movies. I just don't. Like after, when he's kidnapped, I mean, I think that it's interesting because he makes a character turn. So I would say Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like that's a really solidifying, either that or Age of Ultron, because he finally starts to get that like this life of technology that he is like really committed to. Like he realizes he was problematic to build military weapons, but then he tries to use technology for good and it's also problematic. And so I would say either that one or Civil War, because he's just really solidifying who he is after he makes this turn.
Yeah, go, Arthur.
Well, no, I mean, I'd agree with, I need to get my elbows off the table because I'm shaking. I'd agree with Age of Ultron, and I do love that villain becomes sentient, looks at the internet, and decides to wipe out humanity. Not that I wouldn't. What is Reddit? Boom, nope. I think too, the Civil War, he has to pick a side. And it's no longer, I'm going to goof around like he has. You're precisely correct. I agree with you. Is an easier way for me to say that. Spiff?
Yeah, I think I think I also go with Age of Ultron. Although I hadn't thought of it in that way. I was kind of thinking Infinity War. Infinity War for me is a really, so I'll name that I have a hard time always separating Tony and Iron Man, and I think that there are two real distinctions in that. I don't know that you get self-sacrificing Tony at the end against, so these are spoilers and we're just going to name that. So at the end of Endgame, right, if you don't have Iron Man, but at the same time, I don't know. So but I think Age of Ultron, I think you're naming it for me, is a real, is where I see both of them, the Tony and the Iron Man character, coming together as one in a way that it is the growth arc. I think that's the real turning point for both as we move forward in the universe. Yeah, that so one of my questions is like, how do we navigate as people of faith, as faith leaders, how do we navigate kind of our best hopes and dreams for ourselves, our growing edges, with our like real brokenness of our humanity? And for me, that resonates really in Tony's true gift of intelligence, right? Tony is a very smart individual. Like, one of the gifts that was made in him is that he is smarter than most people. Like, that's just part of what, like, his innate gift is.
Yeah.
And at the beginning we see that, you know, he's using that not for good, right? He's using that to create missiles and militarized weapons, and he's proud of that because he's the smartest one doing it. And there's a legacy there. We talked about legacy last week, and so that is, for me, is part of what I wrestle with Tony, and you know, how do we build into the oneness of ourself, of our gifts and our growing edges? And how does Tony exemplify that for us? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. So one of the things that I appreciated about his character growth or character arc or whatever is he had a genuine curiosity. Like, that's kind of what drove his like technology kind of stuff, was like, I wonder if we did this, or I wonder if we could develop this. And that genuine curiosity kind of drove his work. But it was a curiosity that in the first half of his story is driven by his own ego. Like, I wonder if I can do this, right? Yeah. Whereas I think as he grows, his curiosity kind of turns on himself and like who he is and how his community is shaped, and kind of has a sense of curiosity for like, okay, if I can do these things, who am I? And how do I relate to other people? You know, especially with like Captain America and SHIELD and all of that, like, how am I going? There's a curiosity and wrestling there that I appreciate. And so, I mean, I don't know about y'all, but like, a lot of my gifts can also be my own destruction, right? And so I feel like with Tony, his genuine curiosity to make and desire to make things better kind of wrestle with each other within his character.
Arthur, what do you think?
He's got some thoughts cooking. I can see him.
Uh-huh.
Oh, that's a problem with video calls. I think the whole arc of the MCU has to be taken into consideration. And it's Iron Man. So again, and every time we do comic book movies, I'm going to just nerd out. Spiff, remind me to text you about my really ridiculous idea for July.
Okay.
But so, Phil Coulson is an Iron Man 1, and kind of hinting as to what's going on. It's the first movie. They don't know if anything else is going to happen. They just made Iron Man to make Iron Man. And Jon Favreau, by the way, directed the movie that spawned the 19 most popular sequels of all time. And at the very end, the mid-credit scenes is Nick Fury, Samuel L. Jackson, shaved head, eye patch. I want to talk to you about the Avengers Initiative, which blew up the internet in its very early phases of being able to. Anyways, a reboot 10 years prior in the comic books made Nick Fury, who was a white guy with white sideburns and was Mr. like, I'm World War II commando, look just like Samuel L. Jackson and have the shaved head and everything else. They got Samuel L. Jackson's permission after the fact. So putting him in the movie then led to all the speculation. And as they built the rest of the Marvel universe, they had to shift and change. Captain America saying that is America's ass in Endgame was very much not something that would have happened if we look back at the first Avenger. And you can call it development, or I would almost call it erosion. The principledness of Tony Stark became stubbornness in Endgame, where he could have just had the Hulk restore things to how they were and not spur on the conflict at the end. But rather he had decided what he wanted was so important that he was going to create a 5-year gap line. Right? Or maybe I'm over analyzing it and also going in a different direction. I beg your pardons.
No, I just hadn't thought about it in that way.
No, I appreciate the stubbornness aspect.
Well, and if we're talking about holistic whole person type ideology, he's becoming more self-deferentiated, but it's in such an intense way that it is actually like sending off radiation, so to speak, into other people. People are becoming more like Tony Stark because Tony Stark is becoming more like Tony Stark.
Ooh, that's good. Yeah.
You know, the Hulk grows weird, elaborate facial hair. Looks like the Hunger Games stylist got bored and wandered onto the Marvel lot.
Okay, so that's fascinating. I think that I'm gonna have to think on that one. Of the ego of like the first Hulk snap, and what happens with Tony. So I guess going back into that, so we're gonna do a little Enneagram, I assumed, just because I feel like we couldn't. Do you think Tony and Iron Man have the same Enneagram? Like, do they work in that same way? What are their driving needs? Are they different, and do they change? Realizing, friends of the Enneagram, we are not supposed to type people, but as I have said in multiple stories,
no character.
You can type fictional people.
These are from our own experience, how we experience these characters and our understanding of them.
So I'm going to make an argument while you're thinking of the numbers on it. Tony Stark, in the first appearance he has, says, "I am Iron Man." His last line, essentially, in his arc is, "I am Iron Man." I'm going to argue they're inseparable.
I appreciate that interjection because I'm having a really hard time peeling the two apart the way that you see them as two totally separate characters.
Like Batman is Batman and he plays Bruce Wayne, but Iron Man is Tony Stark and Tony Stark is Iron Man.
I generally think that as well, but as I rewatched them this week and really kind of like thought there are distinctions for me now that hadn't been there before.
Well, be honest then.
Yeah, would you
convince us that they need to be separate people?
Talk more on that as I think about if I want to say Tony Stark's a 3 or a super 7.
A 3 or a super 3. So I have Tony at the beginning. So I'll name it again for those of you that have. I'm a 3 with a 4 wing. I think Tony's a 7, and I think Iron Man's a 3. And I think Tony. So, and here's why. And I parceled them out in this way, but also I can very well be convinced that they are both 3s. I think at the beginning there's just a lot of. I think Tony's drive is at the very beginning, and I think even through it, like he's there for joy. There is a certain amount of joy that he gets in, but it's also achievement. So that's why I think that they're really tied. And this is why I brought this up, to be like, let's have a conversation about this, because as I doodled in my own home, I see a lot of myself and lots of things that Tony and Iron Man do, and especially in the I am Iron Man naming, like there's some, and the achievement of kind of fancier Iron Man, like whatever they end up on, whatever the suit numbers are, you know, he's like bust 20 is it Iron Man 3 where he like explodes the mall at one point. But there is a joyfulness, like Tony, the shift in Tony, a big shift in Tony that we see is when he has Morgan, right? When Tony and Pepper have Morgan, and there is that spirit of joy that comes. It's not an achievement of family, but it's a new level of like profound joy that I think drives Tony. And that's why I labeled him as a 7 early.
Well, and you know, the 7 central thing isn't joy, it's more.
Sure. And there's sorry, and I was naming, yes. Thank you for.
Well, I mean, and joy's part of it, because why have bad feelings when you can just eat them or drink them? It's and forgive me, because I'm gonna throw in there. I'm gonna synthesize what you just said. Tony Stark is a counterphobic 6 with an enormous 7 wing, but he also then relies on 5. He's able to take on enormous projects and do 1,000 things, but also able to compile and use as much data as necessary. When he's stressed out, he goes to 3, and he becomes very image focused and very much presents in a certain way. And the stress of being Iron Man, he's going to look more 3-ish.
Ooh.
Because why did he build Ultron? He was scared. He was scared. And why did he hate Thanos? He was scared. He was scared. And that's,
I think fear drives a huge piece of his narrative, whether it's his fear or absorbing Pepper's insatiable fear are two separate things. But I think fear drives a huge part of his narrative.
Mm-hmm.
I'm convinced. I'll go with. I think.
Okay. Yay!
I think it's a counterphobic 6.
Oh, I don't know enough about Enneagram to wade in on this, so.
Neither do we. But it's fun to speculate.
We do. Clearly, I was just like naming. Yeah. So.
No, it's great, and forgive me for disagreeing, I guess, but no.
No, it's not disagreeing.
Wow.
I think it's great, and I'm as someone. I can totally see that, and I think that makes that. That puts them more as one in my book than in the separateness of Tony versus Iron Man. So.
Well, and let us know what you think. If you're versed or not well versed in the Enneagram, leave us a comment, please, or send us an email to 2on1project@gmail.com.
There you go.
I'm trying to say our email address more so people actually email us.
Yeah. So, Cara, I know that we had talked about this, bringing you on for this conversation, because I think a part of what kind of hooked you into being okay with Tony and Iron Man is community and the conversations around like the necessity of community and how they shape kind of our moral understanding, our ethical understanding, and kind of who we are personally. So I guess what does Tony teach us about the necessity of community, in your opinion?
I think so. Tony's original understanding of community is very utilitarian and performative. Like, we have other superheroes because they can all kick ass too, right? But he still thinks he's the smartest one in the room, and he still thinks he should make all the decisions, and there really isn't any space for what real community is, which is considering other points of view and other outcomes and stuff. And I think that's one of his major like wrestling points, is that he can see the like maybe surface level value of community, but really struggles to like see the other benefits of community and to really take them seriously in his work. I mean, his like, even his intimate community of like him and Pepper, he doesn't take her seriously very often or at all.
So can we talk about Spider-Man Far From Home for a second, because I think it ties into that.
Do it.
So, spoilers, of course. We've all seen it, yes? God, it was such a fun movie. So the whole fact that the villain was a con man who had an entire team of people around him, all of whom were united just because they hated Tony Stark. It was the perfect antithesis of Tom Holland as Spider-Man, or not Tom Holland, Peter Parker Spider-Man mourning by himself the death of Tony Stark, who Spider-Man was almost his protege, but kind of wasn't, but kind of was. Like, hey, he calls me Underoos, which is creepy, and builds me a spider suit and then dies. And it kind of fascinated me of, as we speak about community, because they were collaborators, and Mysterio started to fall apart when he stopped collaborating and he instead took on the Tony Stark thing. There you go. And what did he name the virtual reality thing? He named it like Vomit or Barf or Barf.
I think it's Barf, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know, there's a community. I think, Avengers do so well because it's community, and we see the gifts of each Avenger kind of come forth to really have a common goal, which is nice. Obviously, I love the individual movies. Really excited for Black Widow whenever that decides to come out now.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's all going to be, all of these are very cool. But my favorite movies have always been the Avengers movies because I like community and I can very much get into my own my own ego and be like, I can do all these things and I'm gonna save the world by myself. And as we all know, that is just like not possible. It's also not the gospel. And it's not what we are called to do. And so these movies remind me that I have gifts worth sharing. I have gifts worth exploring and cultivating and growing. And I have gifts that are meant to be collaborative, and that my gifts are heightened and my gifts are exemplified for the greater good of whatever we're trying to do. Build the kingdom, grow humanity, just be better people. When they are, when I am at my best, acting in collaborative natures with other people at their best.
And I think, so that's one of the things that I've thought about in thinking about the Tony Stark kind of arc, is that, he kind of starts off with this question of what is a life for? Is it for building bombs that destroy other people, or is it for something else? And I think the question shifts towards the end of who is a life for, instead of what a life is for, because he starts to kind of consider other people besides himself, because that's like one of his big character arcs, is that he tries to not be so selfish. And I think that is kind of a gospel question. There are theologies that think that the life of Jesus is for something. What is it for? It's for a specific thing. And I think more community-oriented theologies talk about who it is for, and that's more expansive. So Jesus didn't just like die to save us all and check that box.
Jesus isn't my personal savior.
Oh, that's yours? Oh, okay. What did you say?
Jesus isn't my personal savior. Jesus didn't die so that I can be excused if I say the magic words.
Right. That Jesus is all of ours, and that we are collectively working to model the life and ministry of Jesus. So I think, some of the shift in Tony's question, I think, is a theological shift if you're thinking about, who we are and what we're here for, or who we're here for.
So I wonder, as you're a consultant, this is how your ministry is working right now. It's what it's turned into, and I think it's brilliant. Ministers aren't good at collaboration. We are given ordination. I coached somebody years ago, and they were like, well, I just got to figure out whatever they want to hear me say, that ordination isn't, special enough, and then I'm going to go do my own thing. I'm like, no, it's you're not special. You're called. I digress. Ministers are bad at collaborating, because if everybody's not listening to me talk on Sunday mornings, or if I'm not running every meeting, there's a problem. What have you found in consultancy is the best way to build collaboration in churches?
Yeah.
Surprise, it's a huge work question.
Yeah, no, that's fine. One of the things that I have been really working on with several of my clients at this juncture is transparency. People can't collaborate on what they can't see or understand or know. And a lot of our older, more established institutions, a lot of our institutions that have allowed themselves to be shaped by whiteness, are institutions that value secrecy instead of confidentiality, or they have processes that are unclear for the sake of muddying how decisions are made and what decisions are made. And so one of the big pieces that I work on with churches is helping them understand the value of transparency, and then what that looks like in a healthy way.
Amen.
Did I
Yeah.
answer the question? Okay.
I mean, I think so. I think transparency. I've one of my like catchphrases, right? And people hear me say it all the time: is transparency is pastoral care. Transparency is a form of care, and
That's whole person.
what?
That's whole person. The transparency of saying, I don't know, I can't do this, I can't handle it.
Yeah, so the transparency to create collaboration is really important, because if you don't understand the work, or the work is being concealed from you. I work with a lot of multi-staff churches, so I'm often working, the way I work is how like lay leaders are interfacing with staffs, but also how staffs are working together. And if there's a lot of quartering off or siloing, that really breaks collaboration. And really, we use the word siloing, I think, from like the 1980s or 90s textbooks on church, but it's really a lack of transparency that we're missing in our organizations to help create collaboration. And I also think, a colleague of mine introduced me to the word candor a few months ago, and I think we lack candor in our churches, like to say the hard, right thing, and be prepared for the fallout in saying the hard, right thing. So a lot of times I get brought in to say the hard, right thing so that the pastor does not have to.
So is Tony Stark the one who has candor?
Ooh, that's such a good question. He has bravado, but is that candor?
Yeah,
and he has snark, but is that candor?
No.
But I will say, as you were talking about transparency, bringing Tony, especially not at the beginning, but at the end when they in Endgame, I think it's Endgame, yeah. When Tony shows up back at the Avengers headquarters and says like, stop Thanos, hopefully, but like save everything I have is like really, I think for the first time, being transparent in his needs and in his vision of what success looks like, and what this new world is, right? Because everyone, so many of the Avengers are living in this space of grief, and Tony is as well to a degree, but like Tony has this new life, and I think that that's a really interesting dynamic, that like he shows up with a wife and child, like his people were taken from him years ago. They didn't die in the snap, and so everyone else is like trying to bring everybody back and like kind of go back to that original world state, and he's like, fine, but as long as I get to keep this. And he's, for the first time, I think, transparent, and I think that that's where we see real leadership in Tony.
But his people did die in the snap. He was directly responsible for everyone else who was on that moon being obliterated, and he was told, you get to survive this because I like your chutzpah. I don't think that's what Thanos said, but it would have been awesome if he used Yiddish. And he had to watch Tom Holland. I keep calling him Tom Holland. He had to watch Spider-Man disintegrate. I'm sorry, Mr. Stark. I don't want to go. And you want to talk the counterphobic thing. Captain America is going to a support group 5 years later, and Iron Man's on his idyllic little lake house with his daughter and wife, and just living the dream, apparently.
Yeah.
I think one of the places, if you want to talk about transparency and collaboration, is this Civil War. Because that was a movie that could have been solved with a meeting. Like, they just all get in a room, they talk to Bucky, they all get the same information, and the second half of the movie wouldn't have happened.
Hey, Cap, you really like Bucky. Why did he kill my parents? He was mind controlled by the Soviets? Okay, thanks. Sorry, Bucky. Hey, I'm really sorry I killed your parents. It's okay, I forgive you. Like,
right, like they just needed a mediator and all to be in the same room, and the whole second half of the movie wouldn't happen because it would have created transparency, and the lack of transparency is what broke apart their collaboration.
Can you imagine what Civil War would look like if they had the conversation? Like, what would the second half of the movie be? Them just like sweeping a building?
It would have just been like a long teaser.
It
would have been like a teaser trailer that like connected what's the movie before, like Iron Man 3 and Age of Ultron or whatever.
You know, or it would have taken the shape of modern rom-coms where everyone goes to therapy, and that's what the second half of the plot's about.
Just
Mm.
a bunch of
Ooh. Ooh.
I would love like MCU like Avengers vignettes of each of them in therapy.
Okay,
Yeah.
so comic book nerding again. I should make a little sign. Dr. Leonard Samson is a green-haired, gamma irradiated, but not like Hulk-like, totally therapist in the Marvel Comics universe. And they do that sometimes. They'll call in Samson to like talk to teams. I think there's an Avengers therapy issue. I'm going to try to find it because it's amazing.
I love that. That's great.
Complete unnecessary digression, which I promised I'd try to avoid today, Steph.
No, it's all good. I'm just looking at my questions. Does anyone else? I have more questions, but Arthur, Kath, or questions? Sorry.
Cara? Cara. No, so that was weird. I apologize. Let's talk about War Machine for a second because he plays in heavily to the Iron Man narrative. And let's ignore the whole replacing the actor and the only major replacement out there. So War Machine being military based, being literally called a machine for war, and having direct ties to the U.S. military. What does that mean that he is being equipped and pulled into it after Stark has broken away from building weapons manufacturing, or from manufacturing weapons and being a producer for the Department of Defense, but then becoming a one-man army himself, and literally having a U.S. Air Force colonel participate with him?
You know, to me, it speaks to the ways that the military-industrial complex, like many of our systems, like capitalism and racism, are made to work the way that they work, and they are made to suck us back in over and over and over again. Like that even if you want to create something that's out here, that the nature of what that is so big that it's constantly re-inviting people back into it, which gets me on my James K.A. Smith kick, which we could talk about all day, about the, you know, the competing liturgies, right? In our culture, like our people show up and we try to provide them an alternate liturgy every Sunday. But there are these other liturgies of like the military industrial complex and capitalism and all of and nationalism that are desiring our heart. And those liturgies are powerful, and they are constantly re-inviting us into allegiance. And I think that a lot of that narrative is watching us as a culture, not necessarily even Iron Man or Tony Stark, but us as a culture when we're making these movies. Like, can Iron Man exist outside the military? Could we have a good guy that is armed to the teeth and not accountable to the U.S. government? Like, it's like, that's a big, like, who is Iron Man accountable to is really a way of asking, like, are we going to allow anything to exist out of the powers of militarism, right? And it's really their question. It's not Iron Man's.
Right.
Because we're constantly being asked to come back into that liturgy and aim our hearts in that trajectory. And I think that's an issue with Iron Man too, that they are constantly being invited back into conversation because the military wants to control the process.
So is Iron Man's real superpower privilege?
A lot of money.
A lot of money, white male, well-spoken, well-dressed, cisgendered, heterosexual. In fact, like, I'm sleeping with I went 12 for 12 with some cover models and that kind of stuff. Like, does he take his alpha broness and is it I'm going to throw out, did Tony Stark's ultimate superpower become leveraging privilege for the sake of people unlike him?
I think that's a really good point. I would make some sort of argument, just having run in privileged circles a lot in my life, that you can have privilege and no brains,
Mhm.
and that's a disaster. So maybe his superpower is that he got coupled with privilege, privilege and a brain, you know? Because most superpowers you get two, right?
What were your superpowers again? Because you cheated on that question.
Flying and superhuman strength. You always get two. Spider-Man can jump on things and shoot webs.
Well, and he has a spider sense, and also the web shooters are mechanical. They're not like he built them.
Yeah, that's true.
That's me being awful. Not in the Tobey Maguire ones. Ooh, hey, clergy friends. Sometimes we should talk about the three different Spider-Men as personas of the Trinity.
Okay.
Shout out to our people.
Someone want to. Pastor Virzola Law keeps chiming in, which I love. I love that she joins us every week. So, Pastor Law, what do you want to be a part of this with?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Spider-Man is what you want, but whoever's out there that wants to do Spider-Man, hit us up.
Yeah, you got to have some Spider-Man nerds to do that one.
For sure. I think, I don't know, I wrestle a lot with the U.S. military and the U.S. military-industrial complex, and loving Avengers obviously puts that in the forefront because your two main people are Cap and Iron Man, and both are intrinsically linked to the U.S. government, and that's a really hard thing to navigate of the heroism. What's the word I'm looking for? The being the idolatry of the U.S. military, and how we are supposed to look to them as consistent heroes within.
Well, and we changed the definition of hero.
Sure.
Budweiser did a marvelous. You remember the Real Men of Genius ad?
Yep.
They were initially real American heroes, and then 9/11 happened, and it became hero was a term only reserved for police, firefighters, and the U.S. military. No one else could be a hero in that regard. So heroism, we can talk about heroics, and heroism in the United States context post 9/11 specifically points to the idolization of specific folk.
Sure.
Right. And for me, that's either something that the Marvel Universe wrestles with and falls a little flat for me, or wrestles with and doesn't quite answer. Is I think part of the Avengers narrative is, can we have an alternate vision outside of this?
Can we live in the vision of the world we wish to see rather than reform the world we want? I want to be cognizant of our time together because of where we are at. I would be happy to continue this conversation with you because I'll be honest, I didn't rewatch any of the Avengers movies in preparation for this, and Tony Stark / Iron Man as an Avenger is probably worthy of at least another hour of your time. That being said,
does that mean I'm going to three-peat?
Would you mind?
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
We can call it Iron Man 1, Iron Man 2, and nobody will watch Iron Man 3. It'll be great. So
I would say people watch Iron Man 1 and Iron Man 3, but no one watches Iron Man 2.
Oh, wait, which one is the one with Whiplash?
That's 2.
Okay, making sure.
No one watches the second Back to the Future either. It's just a thing.
Yeah.
So we have 10 minutes, so I have another question that I think drives into that, and then we'll answer the final one, and then I'll go and either come back. How does that sound?
Okay. I'll be literally right back in 1 minute.
Okay. So, Cara, my question is, and I think that we both understand this in kind of really intrinsic ways, but can those that do justice work rest? And I bring that up as a conversation strictly because, there's that conversation in Endgame between Pepper and Tony about when he discovers that he can time travel, and he says, I can just put it away, we'll be us right here. And she says, but would you be able to rest? And then in his final moments, her final words to him is, we'll be okay, you can rest now. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on kind of what rest looks like for those of us called to justice, which I would argue is one of the factors in being a superhero, but specifically an Avenger. and also a person that follows the gospel of Jesus Christ?
I think that's complicated. I have a really complicated answer for that.
Sure.
Because sometimes rest, particularly for white people, is a way to check out of the work that is emotionally laborious, and it's a way to like pull the ripcord of privilege. And so I just want to name that dynamic that like when we're talking about rest, I am thinking of people that are committed to justice long term and that aren't using rest as a way to check out. But rest is absolutely essential to ministry and to justice work. Like, you know, I talked about James K.A. Smith and the telos of your heart. That's what he kind of calls it, is the trajectory of where your heart is. And, capitalism wants our whole heart. And one of the ways it tricks us into giving it to capitalism is by telling us that we can't and should not rest. And so one of the counter liturgies, I believe, as a Christian, to the demands of capitalism is rest. As long as that is engaged as thoughtfully as the justice work and makes sense for that narrative.
Amen.
The Reverend Rabbi Dania Ruttenberg talked about Sabbath on Twitter, and she said that Sabbath you can neither create nor destroy on.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm somebody who always thinks he's creating and is oftentimes destroying with or without inherent abject participation. I think of Tony Stark, where like every time you see him, he's never at rest. He's always in motion. He's always building. He's always whatever. I just think of the Sabbath implications, but I'm also answering a question that I didn't hear, so I should shush.
The question was, can those that do justice work rest? Bringing Tony, the question of, when he discovers time travel and brings it to Pepper and says, I can just put it away in a drawer and we can go on. And Pepper says, but would you be able to rest? And then at the very end, as he is dying, she says, we'll be okay. You can rest now. And so what rest teaches us about, like had Tony slowed down earlier, would he be more clear to have made a better decision on the original snap and, those types of things? Or did as you're lent to believe in the narrative, did he save the world? Right? Like, did his going save the world? And are you only supposed to rest once your work is done? And I don't know, those types of questions. That's where the question came from.
So can we talk Bible?
Let's talk Bible. Let's do it.
All right. Oh, I should make a little theme song for this. I'm going to work on that.
We need a theme song anyways.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Bible time. Bible time. All right. So who in the canonical or non-canonical Holy Writ of Christianity is the best equivalent for Tony Stark?
Oh, I'm going to go super easy on this one.
Do it.
He's Paul, man, because
what? That
he
okay.
Part of the military industrial complex. He's like killing civilians, right? Like he is doing a murderous thing. And then he is blinded because he's put in a little cave. And he is shown what he has done. And then he comes out and he's Iron Man and he's like trying to make amends for the things he did before he was blind in the cave.
Yeah.
There's not right or wrong answers to this.
But that was really wrong.
No, because here's my answer. He's Judas Iscariot.
Say more.
He is a major influence in the group of people that are brought together around a common issue, common thing. He handles the money. He is brash and rather mercurial. So sometimes he's super cool, and other times he's like, why are we wasting that jar of nard on Jesus' feet? He makes his death is in relation to that which saves the world. And it's like he knows more than anyone else, but doesn't show it. And that, of course, gets into the Judas traditions outside of Scripture that might suggest there's more to a relationship than what had happened.
Yeah.
This is not well thought out, but yeah, I'm going Judas Iscariot.
I like it. This is my favorite question every week because I just think I love that we always show up with such different answers, and which I think is interpretation of pop culture, interpretation of scripture, interpretation of it all, and I think that's really powerful. So in my head, I thought, what do they want me to think this through? Because there are especially in Iron Man 1, there were very biblical narratives, right? So I was like, I think that they want me to go Joshua to Jesus. I think they want me to start with naming the Jericho missile as Joshua and like that whole thing, really dealing in war crimes. Jesus in the end is self-sacrificial in sort of a way. Where I landed is Elijah. I think he's commanding. I think he takes up big spaces. I think he makes these big proclamations and he doesn't play well with others.
And he leaves a little buddy behind.
And he leaves a little buddy behind.
So does Paul. Paul leaves a lot of buddies behind. I'm just going to make an argument. And he's still problematic after gets his sight back.
For sure. I mean, I can see all of these things are working. So, but I literally was just like, ooh, I think he's Elijah.
Well, then we will continue this conversation because it is a good one. You can find out more information about Cara Gilger at Cara Gilger, CARAGILGER.com. Thank you very much for joining us today.
And follow, like, subscribe at 2 on 1 Project on YouTube and Instagram.
If you're a good typist, it's really hard to type 2 on 1 Project. I sent Spiff an email and I had to try 3 different times, and it's an email address I set up. Next week, we will be joined by the Reverend Whitney Waller Cole as we talk about Wet Hot American Summer.
In this wet hot American summer. Sorry.
And we'll have more of our July schedule coming up, but please look forward to Cara Gilger in the future as we are right now. So thank you, friends. Thank you, Cara. Spiff, I'll see you on in the Funny Papers, and I'm going to turn off the recording. Bye, everyone.